Let's take you back now to the Supreme Court, where we are already getting in some rulings, and we are expecting some rulings on controversial cases. This morning, they did rule on one case involving homelessness and loitering laws that came down earlier this morning, and another one just came in. The Supreme Court has overturned a landmark 40-year-old decision that gave federal agencies broad regulatory power. Still on the docket, cases involving Donald Trump's presidential immunity claims and a case dealing with the federal obstruction charge used against hundreds of January 6th rioters. Defense attorney and former federal prosecutor Scott Fredericksen rejoins me now to talk about this. So, Scott, let's talk about that ruling that just came in. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday when we were talking about the EPA decision. What about this case? And you sort of previewed what we were going to see this time around.
Yeah. Well, this is a momentous decision, one that may not have a high profile like the immunity decision, but this case takes a sledgehammer to the power of federal agencies to interpret and administer the regulations that they're charged with enforcing. That may be the EPA, that could be the Labor Department, all the different agencies. What we're talking about here is what's called the Chevron doctrine. It dates back 40 years, and basically it said, look, when a federal agency is enforcing and administering a law of Congress and there's some ambiguity, courts have to defer to the agency that enforces that regulation for its interpretation of that regulation. This Chevron doctrine has been under attack by conservatives now for the last couple of decades. And today, the Supreme Court sided with conservatives. This removes a huge amount of power of federal agencies in their enforcement of the laws that they are responsible for. So this means we're going to see a huge rollback, lots of litigation about the different federal agencies in their enforcement of regulations.
All right, Scott Fredericksen breaking it down for us. A monumental decision, perhaps not one as high profile as the last couple of ones that we're expecting, but still an important one for people who those regulatory agencies were in fact set up to protect. And I think that that's the real issue here. I know that we talked about yesterday the federal government and many conservatives feeling that the federal government had too much power and perhaps had overreached in some of those cases. But again, a lot of these agencies were set up in the wake of really terrible things that happened. Either we're talking about the SEC, where people suffered through the Great Depression, or what we were seeing in the late 1950s and 60s in terms of the environment when the EPA was set up.
Well, you're 100% right, Vlad. I think we're really going to see that in the area of the EPA, having to do with water pollution, air pollution. You know, people forget that back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, you know, our rivers were on fire. You couldn't see our cities because of smog. A huge reason that all got cleaned up were the laws that Congress passed and the regulations the EPA enforced. Now, the conservatives said, you've gone too far, though. The agencies are basically a power unto themselves. In this case, we had a New Jersey commercial fisherman who was required to take a monitor of the federal agency involved in fisheries along when he was out fishing. They didn't challenge the fact of having a monitor, but the agency said, and you have to pay them $700 a day. And that's what was challenged. And so conservatives said, look, that's not what the statute says. That's up to Congress, or at least the courts, to decide. Regardless, we're going to see a huge rollback of what the agencies have been able to achieve. And, you know, the EPA is probably the best example of what's going to change now in this country.
All right, Scott Fredericksen, thank you, my friend. Appreciate you. CBS News campaign reporter and attorney Katrina Kaufman is standing outside of the Supreme Court. All right, Katrina, we've still got two other cases that we're waiting on. And of course, if those cases come in, we're going to have a special report anchored by Norah O'Donnell. But describe to our viewers what they are and what is at stake here.
The biggest case that we are watching out for is the one involving presidential immunity. And this was brought by former President Donald Trump, who claims that presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution for their official acts. the court will be making a determination about whether or not the president has immunity and potentially distinguishing between private acts and what counts as official acts. The short-term implication for this will be for the very important DC election interference case against Trump, and whether, when, and how it can move forward before the November election, if it can, because of course, if Trump is elected as the next president, he could get that case dismissed altogether. The other case that relates back to the DC election interference trial as well is Fisher. This is related to the January 6th Capitol riot. It was brought by one of the rioters, Joseph Fisher, a former police officer who says that a statute that was brought against him related to the obstruction of an official proceeding doesn't apply to the January 6th Capitol riot. It's always been used related to documents and records, and this also involves two of the charges against Trump in the DC election interference case. So it could impact the shape of that case as it moves forward, depending on how the Supreme Court rules on this.
All right, all eyes on SCOTUS, even at this late hour. All right, Katrina, thank you very much. We'll check back in with you if those decisions come in. Thank you.